Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly.
Britain's Guardian newspaper obtained a copy of a secret court order authorizing the data collection. The document shows the information is being collected indiscriminately and in bulk.
We really are in a period of insanity right now. America's gone crazy about terrorism and is responding in ways which are increasing the terrorism. And some people are very happy to do that because it's intensely profitable.
Who was organizing the whole thing? Alan Dulles. Okay, he was a major part of Operation Paperclip, and that was through the rat lines of the Vatican. The Vatican, the city of London, that's the financial center. The Vatican is the so-called religious center, and the war center is Washington, D.C.
But you said that Carlos the Jackal works for the trilateral families. Now, what are we talking about? Who are the trilateral families you're referring to here? Because ultimately you're saying these are the real people behind it.
You're talking about the Illuminati. If you think they're not real, you're a fool.
What really is behind is that those who control the information about the alien presence on Earth, want to keep it to themselves. There's been hundreds of trillions of dollars have been spent on doing the research and on dealing with this subject since 1947.
Hey everybody, this is the Holy Hand Grenade. Welcome to the show. Taking every thought captive, we assault the boundaries of reality in this quantum game of hide and seek. It's a new perspective of Earth, from Earth. This is the Reality Distortion Effect on Take on the World TV.
Professor, it's great to have you here. First off, I want to say that The American Deep State is your greatest book.
Thank you.
Now, I thought we'd start our discussion today by having you define what the deep state is. What does it encompass? And how would an average person understand its role in our daily lives?
Okay, well, we can begin by saying that there is a gap in attention between the institutions that are defined by the Constitution, are responsible to the Constitution on one level, and then the second level, institutions like the CIA and the NSA, which operate in secret. There's something about secret power that it's not controllable, and it's very important that the CIA's budget has never been exclusively the budget voted by Congress. So it's a level of the deep state higher than the public state. And then I want to go to a third level. Well, we skip to the fourth level, which ultimately Roosevelt himself said to a friend back in 1933, you and I know that a financial element has been controlling this country since the age of Jackson. Well, that is
Wow.
That's the ultimate level, I think, is extreme wealth and the institutions that deal with extreme wealth. But in between, there's a third, for public level, CIA level, and then companies like Booz Allen Hamilton that interface with the CIA, recruit from the CIA, and are recruited by the CIA. And then they also work with corporations all over the world and with banks all over the world. And the same thing happens. There's an interaction of a revolving door, both between these corporations and the CIA, and also between these corporations and the highest level of banks and major oil companies and so on.
Okay.
And so the ensemble is a level, you have levels of government, some of which are written about in the media, and some of which are not written about in the media. You very rarely see Booz Allen Hamilton in the headlines, but if you write what I would call a deep history of, say, American relations with Egypt, the CIA is going to be in that history, and the Booz Allen Hamilton are going to be in that history.
Right. So ordinarily, we're looking at the public side of our society, elective government, law and order justice, daily news reporting, and that kind of thing. But underneath, there are these deep state forces that are operating in contracting for intelligence agencies, in corporate, financial, and political circles, and they are having an impact with very little transparency.
Right. So there's a lot of things in the deep state that I talk about in this woolly way because we think of history as taught in universities is archival history, working with documents, and that gives us, that's a good method, and we get good history, but we get limited history because a lot of what's going on in the deep state is undocumented.
Right.
And when people like me try to write deep history, we have to resort to all kinds of techniques to fill the vacuum because we don't have, as a rule, every now and then we're lucky and we get a document here.
Yes, well, there have been some breakthroughs, I would say, with Freedom of Information Act requests, even if they are few and far between. Now, can you think of a document that when it came out, it just made you stop and say, this is major?
A key one, we have the CIA document after the Kennedy assassination instructing the media on how to handle it. And they use the phrase conspiracy theory. As far as I know, that's the first time that we have a document that talks about conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
It's the CIA telling the newspapers how to attack people like me.
Right, and the basic instructions from the CIA to their media assets was call them conspiracy theorists, and that will have the effect of marginalizing them and take some of the heat off.
Right, exactly. Well, we don't get many of those documents. We get a few. But we have to look around the known world that we see and we read about in the newspapers. And I think actually most Americans have some awareness of this. You know, if they live in a city like Chicago,
sure,
maybe not now, but 50 years ago, the mob was in City Hall. And anybody who had anything to do with City Hall knew that because they had to pay certain people off and so on.
Right.
It's not in the official history of Chicago.
Well, this is interesting because you've done some real investigation on how organized crime is a component of the deep state and has these connections that we don't hear very much about.
That's where I really began with this kind of analysis because I wrote a book called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK.
That's an excellent book.
The biggest gap in the Warren report is when they were saying that Ruby was a loner, when Ruby was obviously somebody very clued in with the mob, and that's half of it, also very clued in with Dallas high society, and above all, clued in with the Dallas police. And we actually have testimony from Dallas police officers saying they used Jack Ruby as an informant on the drug traffic, and we have somebody else who told the FBI that a big drug deal only went through in Dallas after Jack Ruby gave the okay on it. Now, the Warren Commission received these documents, and then they said he was a loner. Well, that taught me that you have to see more to politics than what's on the record.
Yeah.
And organized crime was where I went in. That led me to the drug traffic. It led me to the CIA. And
yes, and you found that interface between the CIA and organized crime.
Yeah.
In your book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, you outline all of these intelligence connections that Oswald had and how through these connections he was set up to appear in a certain way as a kind of leftist loner, and that this method was actually used in 9/11 also, but there it was applied to 19 people instead of just one.
Yes, I think that I have more than one book where I draw attention to the analogies between Kennedy assassination and 9/11, And this is one of them, that what I call the designated culprits.
Yeah, that's a great
people
term.
Who are already known to the agencies, in the CIA in particular, and in both cases, the CIA was covering up, both on Oswald and on the alleged hijackers, to make sure that they would not be rounded up before the deep events that they are attached to, because then they couldn't have been the designated culprits.
I see. So on a certain level, they're being protected right up to the point where they can be used in a scapegoat role.
Right, and that's a matter of history now with Oswald, but it should be a matter of grave concern, and actually is right now. People campaigning to get those 28 pages from the Joint Congressional Investigation of 9/11 released, because it will show, we pretty well know a good deal of the story by now anyway, but it would be an official documentation of the Saudi money going to these alleged hijackers, the CIA's protection of these hijackers, the lying, saying that they had given money to the information to the FBI when in fact they had refused to give, as they should have given the information to the FBI. All of that would come out. That would be one way, I think, of ending the state of emergency we're in, to see the really corrupt way in which it was instituted in 9/11 in the first place.
I've speculated for a long time that elements of these deaths fit a certain pattern and probably involved a lot of the same players, but I haven't seen anyone who's mapped out these people and the connections between these ritualistic murders like you have. So this is pretty important work, and I guess the best place to start us off would be as close to the beginning as we can get, and this group of assassins seems to carry out their activities under the name Operation 40, right? So can you tell us about how this group was put together?
I can indeed. I tell you, like you said, I spent 30 years looking into this, even more than 30 years, and I thought that all of these different events was totally separate. I had no idea that they were connected in any way or form, and it's just over the years, the deeper I've been digging into them, that I ended up with the leads taking me the exact same route and tracking me back down to the same small elite group. The group I'm talking about is the group that is now behind the so-called New World Order. But not only have I found that it is this so-called power elite, I prefer calling them minority because there's so few actually, even though they're trying to scare us into believing that they're so extremely powerful. I would say we're the ones that are powerful, at least, and we're outnumbering them in the millions, billions. But not only is it the same group that are behind so many of these atrocities. I mean, we're talking high-level assassinations, terror acts, all types of different wars, civil wars, you name it. So much mayhem in the world. Not only is it the same group that are given the orders from way up in the near the top of the pyramid, power pyramid, but also what I found out is that they've actually used the same type of assassins, not only the same type of assassins, but actually the same assassins for decades, really decades. And this has been a mind-blowing experience for me to find out this thing. And just like you said, the group that I have exposed, or I'm focusing on exposing big time, is a group called Operation 40 or Group 40. Now, if I take you back to the late 1950s and very early 1960s, the president at that time was Dwight Eisenhower, and they were in a situation where they thought that it would be good to put together a team of problem solvers, as they sometimes call them, a team of assassins that could be sent globally to get rid of whoever they wanted, because here we're not talking only so-called politics, but it's big business, and we're talking, the big military-industrial complex, major companies like United Fruit, Standard Oil, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, these type of companies that were behind that and that was trying to invade the rest of the world, just rape and plunder, and they needed a violent tool to be able to use when they had problems in Latin America or in the States or in Europe, wherever. So the order didn't really come from Dwight Eisenhower, but he accepted that this was being carried out, and the task was given to his vice president, a man by the name of Richard Nixon. At that time, Nixon's career was going downhill quite a lot. He was not very famous at the time, but he was given the task to put this team together. And what he did was he used a veteran team, or a team of hardened veterans from the coup in Guatemala, 1954, when they took out the dictator, or the president there, and he used these people, and the people he used from the CIA was E. Howard Hunt, who was later very famous as one of the Watergate burglars. You will see here that all the people involved in the Watergate burglary were from Operation 40. He's also famous for his part in the JFK assassination, and if you want to later we can go into great details about the JFK assassination, where I can point out a major part of the shooters involved came directly from Operation 40. Another man was Ted the Blonde Ghost Shackley, who was an incredible, skilled and very, very cold, hard CIA operative who made his way all the way up to the top of the CIA, being the chief of the covert operation for the Western Hemisphere. The man that he took over the job from was also part of Operation 40. This was way down the line in the 70s when he took over after him. But the man that he worked side by side with, his name was David Atlee Phillips. He was also known under Harold Benson or Maurice Bishop, these two identities. This was a man, an incredible expert on propaganda, and he has been behind so much of this brainwashing propaganda, how to trick population into believing a lot of these false flag operations and so on. And David Atlee Phillips was actually not only, he was the station chief in Mexico City at that time, but he was also the CIA controller of no one less than Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy for the JFK assassination, the one that had to take the fall for it. That was actually totally innocent. What he was trying to was actually to reveal that the assassination was going down, and he was trying to save the JFK. So I actually see him historically as a hero, absolutely not this hoodlum that he's been painted out as.
Interesting.
But David Atlee Phillips was also the controller for James Files, who was the shooter behind the picket fence and who was the one that fired the final headshot. According to me, I've studied this guy for years. He's still alive, and I've only found one little lie that he told over the years. He's incredible in his detail, and I totally believe this guy's word, even though some researchers thinks he's lying. So David Atlee Phillips, not only the controller for the patsy, but also for one of the shooters, and deeply involved in the JFK assassination, and many. Like I say, he later became the head of the CIA for the Western Hemisphere for covert operations. I mean, this is a major player. So we got these people, and what they did was they sent these people down to Florida, mostly, to recruit. Most of the people they recruited were exiled Cubans who had just escaped from Cuba, where Fidel Castro had taken over. And many of these people were former police men, Batista regime. They were from force. Some of them were high-up politicians. Many of them brutal, very brutal people, mercenaries and soldiers and so on. So they were recruited in Miami into this very, very secret group called Operation 40. There was one woman, Marita Lorenz, who was a former lover of Fidel Castro, and they recruited her as what they wanted was for her to assassinate Fidel Castro, but she never did. Apparently, she had, doesn't matter. She had a child with another dictator and so on. She is also still around. But in this group, Operation 40, it is unreal once you start studying who the members of this group is. There's more and more information coming out. I've done everything I can to dig up as much as possible, but the connections and what these people have been up to, because they have been extremely busy since the early 1960s, and some of them all the way up until today. Some of them are white-haired old guys now, but still active, I tell you. And Operation 40 has been called the grandmother of operations. It was almost like they were the ones that pulled off the big one with JFK. And after that, they have been very central in many hits and false flags, but also in educating other assassins and so on. So when you study this group, you will see that, for instance, there's one man called David Morales. He was in Dealey Plaza. He was one of the guys driving the escape cars. He was the one that picked up the 3 people from the top floor where Lee Harvey Oswald is said to have been. There's multiple shooters, so I'm just pointing out a few points. But they ran out on behind the Texas School Book Depository. He picked them up in Ruth Payne's car and drove off. But he was also at the Ambassador Hotel in '68 when Robert Kennedy was assassinated, together with 2 other CIA operatives, and just surveying or being in control of the whole situation. So he was both in Dallas and in Los Angeles when Robert was killed.
Wow.
He was also the guy that killed Che Guevara. He was together with Felix Rodriguez, who was another one from Operation 40, and who is super central in the whole Iran-Contra scandal, and who has followed George Bush Sr. Side by side through his whole career as one of the problem solvers, taking people out and getting rid of whatever problem appeared.
Man.
And they went. They were Henry Kissinger, which is one of the major players here, also when it comes to the CIA operation and so on. They were sent down to Bolivia to track this guy down, and they used some local soldiers, and then it was Felix Rodriguez and David Morales. They tracked him down, they caught him, and Felix was the one that gave the order to execute him, but the guy that actually shot him was Che Guevara. No, sorry, it was David Morales.
Who shot Che Guevara.
Yeah, and Felix Rodriguez to this very day is walking around with Che Guevara's wristwatch. Very proud of that one.
Oh, wow. Talk about insult to injury.
Well, they're proud of what they're doing, you know. They see themselves, I don't know. I've spoken to friends of these people and asked, how do these people see themselves? Because when you look at it, I would call them terrorists, you know, because these are cold-blooded murderers and doing terror acts against normal people. But the people I've spoken to, they say that they it's almost like gunslingers in the Old West, you know. They live by the gun, they die by the gun, and they're proud of it, you know. Even though I think some of them must be very, very scared because they are in deep shark waters, you know, surrounded by very violent people.
Right, but it's a fascinating thread of research. I mean, I've been very impressed with the whole story and all the names involved, but I would love to hope that they're scared, but I think they feel like they're so above the law that nothing can happen to them. I mean, there's also 3 generations of the Bush family involved in this operation as well, correct?
This is the unreal thing, you know, because the paymaster that was appointed to take care of funding this group, he was the one that funneled the funds from the military-industrial complex, from oil tycoons, from these big major corporations and so on, and from the mob as well, was pumping money into this, because the CIA and the mob are 2 sides of the same coin. I would say with the FBI as well. It's so, you know, it's so infiltrated, so there's no real difference, you know, depending on what is needed to be done. The CIA uses the mob within the borders, the US borders. As soon as they go abroad, they use their own people. And when they do these terror acts and false flag operations, every single time it's the FBI who's training, funding, equipping these different teams that are carrying it out. So the so-called good guys, I would put a very big question mark to. And this is the scary thing. The people that are there to protect you are the ones we have to fear. So it's. Unfortunately, I have people who was murdered in Sweden around me because we were investigating the assassination of the Swedish Prime Minister, and these two people were not sensitive for that. When you dig into these things, you are actually like in a minefield. You have to step carefully, and unfortunately, it's only after you stepped on a bomb or a mine that you actually understand it, that it happens.
Right.
And these people were not. They were getting too big-headed, and they kept approaching the official investigation. And we will come to that later. But the official investigation in these major political hits are part of the crime. It's their own people, their own investigation that are on standby. So as soon as the shots are fired, boom, in moves their investigation, so that they can 100% control the whole thing and make absolute sure that nothing of the real truth will come forward.
Right.
So these are the people you have to be aware of and to keep your distance from. And my friends, unfortunately, just kept pushing, and they ended up dead, both of them. So, and I left the country just after that because I felt it's getting too close.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, man. That's super sad, but I commend their bravery and yours. I mean, yeah, you're right. You just don't know how much revealing is too much until it's too late.
I'm just an ordinary guy. I mean, it's not my job to do these things. I'm not being paid by anyone. Absolutely, I don't even really know what I'm doing it, except for that I want to. I have a major problem when I see people bullying others, or people being harassed or beaten up or killed,
Of course.
And when I see when somebody's trying to rape the world, I mean, it is on that level at the moment. It's just, we need to do something, even if it might be with a high price. I mean, so many beautiful people have died. We're going to talk a lot about some of them. Beautiful, beautiful, brave people. And for some, this is the price you have to pay. And I have accepted that, even though I really prefer to stay here. But I know that this is a risk. And at the same time, somebody needs to do it, because otherwise it's in the silence that these people thrive. It's in the darkness that these people thrive. It's in the in the behind the scenes, the hidden hand behind the scenes, that's where they can keep pulling these things off. And so my website is lightonconspiracies.com, and it's a very handpicked name because what I try to do is aim the spotlight right on them, exposing, put the light on, show what is going on. Mm-hmm. Totally non-violent, but fearlessly just exposing it so that it will stop. Right. Because as soon as we see how they pull these things off, the more people that awake to the fact how they pull these false flag operations and political assassination, how they do it, once it's done, once you see it, they can't pull it off anymore, So this is my focus.
Yeah, you're right. It seems like to anyone who's really paying attention, the same patterns repeat. You mentioned earlier that they come right in with their own official investigations, which are always bullshit, and yet we let that happen time and time again. The other thing that they constantly do is when they have one of these Operation 40 highly skilled assassins take someone out, there's almost always a drugged up, spaced out guy there as a patsy who doesn't even really know what happened. It was interesting to hear that even the shooter who tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan, he was a patsy there, and he had dinner with one of the Bush sons right before the shooting. I mean, it's so crazy. You don't have to go that deep to find these really close connections to the people you had mentioned and the Bush family. They're really at the helm of a lot of this stuff.
I tell you, so often these things are no-brainers, and why people don't see it, I have no idea. I mean, sometimes I just feel, how asleep can you be? It's incredible the level of not insomnia, that's not the real word, but like how unconscious we have been.
Right.
I look at myself as well. Because, many of these things, if you take Robert Kennedy, the assassination, Sirhan had a revolver, 22, with 8 bullets in it. Somewhere around 12 or 13 bullets were fired. Do you have to be very clever to see 8, 12, 13, he didn't have a chance to reload. There must have been a second shooter, okay? You look at, he was standing right in front of Robert Kennedy when he started firing, okay? As soon as he started firing, they jumped him and they grabbed his gun and they put him down on a steam table and got the gun away from him, okay? You look at the number of people wounded. There were lots of people wounded around him. And Robert Kennedy, of course, since Sirhan was always right in front of Robert Kennedy, of course, all 3 shots that hit Robert Kennedy must have come straight from the front. Absolutely not. He was hit 3 times, actually 4. The 4th didn't hit him, but the 3 shots hit him straight from the back and to the right. And the last bullet was fired point blank, touching his skull,
Mm-hmm.
So the big question is, how could Sirhan go and shoot from behind and to the right? He could not.
Right.
So you don't have to be very intelligent to understand the shooter must have been behind him and to the right,
Mm-hmm.
But still to this day, no, it's Sirhan. And this poor guy who is absolutely innocent, he was an MK Ultra victim, a really nice Palestinian guy, absolutely great guy, and he spent almost his whole life, in prison. He's still in prison to this very day, rotting away because of something he had nothing to do with.
Yeah.
It's a shame. And all of us who are asleep are allowing these things to happen, We should be ashamed that we allow innocent people to be stuffed away in and being blamed for things like this.
Well,
and in the center of so much of this is the Bush family.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly, the level of criminality around that family, unreal.
It is, and it's amazing that they don't get caught. I mean, I guess they are just above the law, because even when they do get caught, at least in the years where the Bushes have been presidents, there have been a couple of times I learned about from you where they have just pardoned the guys in the crew who have gotten caught. So there have been times where these guys go to jail, and then Bush the father or the son as president is just like, bring them out of jail. Like, I mean, the boldness, the audacity to put yourself in the public eye and so connected, so closely related to these people and just have no fear of prosecution. I mean, that little bit of the puzzle, the fact that they just pardon these people outright, really is probably the most frustrating part, because you think you got them caught, and then, nope.
But what does that say about us?
Well, yeah.
What does it say about us? Why do they treat us without respect? Because we don't really deserve it, do we? I mean, because they have been getting away with murder, literally. I mean, we're talking mass murder in the form of all of these unjust wars that they have pulled off.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at it, when JFK was assassinated, November 22, that was when it all began. Look back, all of these different awful things. The Vietnam War, Operation Condor, all of these overtakes in Latin America, where they killed thousands and thousands of people in Bolivia and Chile with Operation Condor. All of these assassinations globally, many wars, civil wars that they have created as well. And if they haven't been able to do it with military force, then they've sent in their tools, which are, now I'm talking about the global elite, not the Bush family, but the UN, the NATO, the World Bank, the IMF, and so on. If they couldn't hit them military-wise, they'd send in the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Very often they go hand in hand, and they go in and they just crush country by country by giving them loans that will just totally wipe them out.
Yeah.
Them not being aware of it. or giving them all of these loans, okay, dear Somalia, now please, focus on cotton. We will give you all of these grants and loans and whatever if you totally focus on cotton. So the whole country start growing cotton. Then after 4 or 5 years, they suddenly say, no, sorry, we're going to buy it from Gambia or somewhere.
Right.
And the whole country, they've done this in so many countries. The whole financial situation in that country is just wiped out overnight because suddenly they can't sell cotton. And at the same time, they have all of these loans that they will never be able to repay.
Mm-hmm.
And they've done it on countless countries. So that's just one of the ways. They have many different tactics.
And just because they're removed from it doesn't make them any less guilty, just because it's not at the point of a gun, because people need to remember poverty is one of the most extreme weapons these people have, and it has probably killed more people on the planet over time than anything has, and it's something that could be fixed very easily. Just because they don't have the right green paper doesn't mean they should all starve to death, but when you add those deaths to the list, yeah, it's ridiculous how many they're responsible for. And in terms of the Bush family, it makes 9/11 just seem like another day at the office, doesn't it?
No, it makes Adolf Hitler look like a schoolboy.
Man.
I'm not kidding. I am not kidding. We're talking numbers that are unreal. And when we talk about Hitler, one of the main funders for Adolf Hitler was Prescott Bush, George Bush Sr.'s father. Mm-hmm. Which not everybody is aware of. He was. It was not him personally that took all his money going to Adolf Hitler, but he was the one funneling the money into the Nazi war machine. There were two other key players, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles. They were brothers. They were lawyers, American lawyers, working together with Adolf Hitler and E.G. Farben, the giant chemical. German giant that you can almost equal E.G. Farben and the Nazi war machine. These two go together. So when you see who was funding it, you will see who was behind it. Mm-hmm. And these people afterwards, when the war came to an end, because this elite has funded both sides in both world wars. Incredible, but when you look into it, it's absolutely true, and they do that on a regular basis. They fund both sides to keep the conflict going. Right. They thrive on death and destruction. That is their game. So the longer they can get it going, the better. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Then after the Second World War, when the world thought, "Oh, thank God, we got rid of the Nazi threat." No, I'm sorry, you did not, because what you did, you had a small group of patsies that went to Nuremberg, the trial in Nuremberg. Most of them low-key generals. They had absolutely no idea really about the major agenda. And the rest, they had killed them and put them in jail and so on, these 12 ones, or they committed suicide. And then a major part of the rest ones, of these hardened Nazis, were imported into the States and South America through Operation Paperclip. Mm-hmm. Who was organizing the whole thing? Allen Dulles. Okay, he was a major part of Operation Paperclip, and that was through the rat lines of the Vatican. We will get back to the Vatican, the city of London. That's the financial center. The Vatican is the so-called religious center, and the war center is Washington, D.C. These are the three places they play ball in between. So mm-hmm. They just. Anyway, so Allen Dulles and then helped all these Nazis. And the Nazis, they got into America, for instance. You had people like Reinhard Gehlen and many of these awful Mengele and Klaus Barbier and people like that imported. And they were part of building up the OSS at that time that later turned into the CIA. Mm-hmm. Here we are, where one of the first directors was Allen Dulles.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, surprise. He was also deeply involved in the JFK assassination and later member in the Warren Commission that was investigating the assassination. No wonder that we never found out what actually happened officially. And they were also part of this totally starting the whole NASA thing with the rocket, Werner von Braun and all of these people. So and they're deeply involved in so many different areas in modern society. And these companies that were behind the German war machine, BSF and IG Farben, and so the only thing they did was they changed the name of the companies. They're still around, still same agenda, and they're still just pushing forward.
Many of you will recognize Jack O'Halloran for his boxing career or his film career, having been in such films as Superman 2 as the henchman of the original Zod. But he has a more surreptitious reputation based on his ancestry that many people don't know about. That he came from the lineage of a famous mafia don named Albert Anastasia. And recently he came out with a book called Family Legacy. So Jack is joining me to discuss what he has seen and heard and known from his experience about the Kennedy assassination. Jack, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, in the book Family Legacy, first of all, we can get into the background of, your ancestry and lineage, but I want to go right into this event, the events around 1963 on November 22nd, when you say that you were actually in Dallas the night before, or the day before Kennedy was arrived and killed. And you had an interesting encounter with some very powerful people that were all in town for this occasion. So why don't you describe a little bit of how you ended up being in Dallas at that time?
I went down there because I was on the predication that I was going to do a tryout and play with the Dallas Cowboys. And the coach took me to this party, which was arranged by some people because they wanted me to see what was going on and to see the actual people that were gathered at a place. And it was interesting, Clint Murchison Jr. had an amazing house that was like a ranch in the middle of Dallas. And he held some interesting parties there. And he had a party called Egyptian Nights. And the host of the party was J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover, the boss, the head of the FBI.
And the people that were there, you had the major primary bankers of New York. John McCloy was there. And Allen Dulles was there. And the Rockefellers were there, and their advisor was there. There were several other financial banking entities that were there. You had 4 potential presidents of the United States were there.
Like which ones?
Ford, Nixon, Bush, and Johnson. All 4 of them were there. Johnson was the last one coming. He came in late. Madeline Brown was there.
His mistress.
Yeah. It was just a host of people. It was a lot of wealthy people, a lot of people that came from different walks of life. It was an interesting, eclectic group, They was very enlightening.
In what sense? Because obviously Murchison is the owner of the Cowboys, so you probably thought, okay, I'm meeting with the owner because I might be playing for this team. But did you have a sense that there was something?
Oh, I went there for a different reason. I didn't go there. That was a coy. I mean, The same as that whole party was a ploy, because all the Ford, Nixon, everybody else, there was a big convention at the Sheraton Hotel in Dallas that they were officially supposed to be at. And from there, they came over to this party. But they had an official reason for being in Dallas. And there were people from the FBI that swore J. Edgar Hoover was nowhere near Dallas that night, but he was sitting as close to me as you are. So you can't tell me that the man wasn't there, So, and there was an interesting energy. And when Johnson came in, it was late, and they all went into a room. And they were there for a period of time. That's when I left. There was no reason to stay there any longer. It was they went in to discuss something, and the ironic part of it is that the way that the whole thing was put together. When you stop and I don't know if you've ever read the Warren Commission
Not
report,
the full thing.
And that was Allen Dulles, and it was written by guys from Yale. Ford and other people contributed to it. Arlen Specter, a few other people, and it was all bogus. I mean, in the very beginning of it, when they questioned Jack Ruby, and when they went in to question him, and they said, you know, they started to talk to him, and Ruby said, I guess you want to talk to me about Chicago, and they said, no. You know, so if you're going to do something, why would you, you know, muck around? And you have, I think there's like 32 volumes of the Warren Commission, and it's just one ridiculous statement after the other, and it keeps reiterating things and turns them backwards and upside down and everything else. And it is nowhere near an assessment of what went on at all. Mm-hmm. If you were going to sit down and say, who was one person that was responsible for the death of John F. Kennedy, you'd have to say his father, Joe. Because his father was, I mean, you got to look at the man. You got to look at the fact of the coldness and the cold-heartedness of a man who lobotomized his own daughter because she had what we call today ADD and bipolar disorder. And he did not want her acting out in public. So he lobotomized her and locked her up, and she lived to be a very old woman in an institution. What person does that to your own family?
Right.
And John Kennedy himself would not have lived out his term. If you look into his medical records, he was a dying man. He was dying of 4 different diseases. They shot him up every single day just so he could function. Addison's disease is a deterioration of your back. He was well advanced into that. He had syphilis and 2 other diseases that were just, you know, crumbling his body. And his father would rather see him die the way he died in Texas as a martyr than to see him die as a sick person in the family and put a mark on the family. That's pretty cold.
As they talk about, you know, in kings are killed and that sacrifices take place.
Well, you know,
but what do you mean by ultimately Joe Kennedy's responsibility?
Ask yourself a question. Who was the #1 cop in the country when John Kennedy died?
His brother, Bobby.
Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was his brother's second skin his whole political career. 8 people, including Adlai Stevenson, went to see Bobby to tell him, do not let your brother go to Texas. The animosity down there is atrocious. Adlai Stevenson had just came from Houston, Texas, where they were spitting at him. Mm-hmm. The undercurrent was not good. And it was all due to the sins of the father. Because when Jack Kennedy was being nominated in California, H.L. Hunt went to California and gave a big bundle of cash to Joe Kennedy for Johnson to be put on as vice president. When John Kennedy was made president, one of the first things that his father did was he told his son, you must instill a tax on the oil people of Texas. They make too much money. It angered a few people, you know.
Right, so it went after his original backers, including the mafia.
Well, the mafia, you know, when people say the mafia was to blame, the mafia, the CIA, the Teamsters were used like puppets because of Joe Kennedy's anger, because of people being angry at Joe Kennedy. The mafia had all the right in the world to be angry at him, because if it was not for Sam Giancana, John Kennedy would have never been nominated in LA, ever. And then when it came to the election, he would have never won the election. I mean, there were people in Cicero in Illinois who voted, they were dead people voting 20 times.
Yeah, I mean, that was notorious, the corruption of
Illinois. It was a fact.
Nixon wanted to challenge the vote.
When Joe Kennedy went out to cry on Giancana's shoulder about getting his son elected, first Irish Catholic to be elected to the United States Congress. And Chicago owned him. They had him under thumb.
Joe Kennedy.
Joe Kennedy. And that was from 1922. They owned him. They saved his life, and they saved his life more than once. And he did a lot of things that were nefarious during the whole, and that things that angered a lot of people. I mean, the Depression was not created specifically to be a depression. What the deal was that in 1926, Europe investors were screaming at America for that they were not getting the return on their money. They felt they were being cheated. And the fact that America was now a war-bearing country and was taking jobs and it was building war-bearing equipment and it was taking jobs away from Europe. And not only are you taking jobs and income away from us, you're not giving us a right return on our money, and we invested and we built your country, which they did. And if you look at last year, who was the biggest investor in America? Everybody thinks Japan, China. 35% of world investment comes from the United Kingdom, which comes from Geneva. Every single year. Okay? They're still the biggest investors. So in 1926, there was a place in Chicago called the Hamilton Club, which was a powerhouse politically like New York Athletic Club. And they sat down and they said, we've got to do something about this because these people are really pressuring us and that. So they sat down with Joe Kennedy, who was a brilliant banker. Can never take away what the guy was, intelligence and everything else. He was a brilliant banker. And they said, we got a little Troy for you we want you to do. And the first thing that they did was they stole $5 million in common share stock from Pathé Newsreel, right in broad daylight. No one ever caught it. They said, boy, that's pretty good. That's clever. We like that. Now this is what we really want you to do. And they devised a short sell against 30 companies from Europe that belonged to the Rothschilds and the Jewish banking families of Geneva, the banking circle. And the short sell went very well the first week, and then they were going to take a few days, the weekend off, and come back the next week. And by Friday, because the market was going up and down all over the place, the people of America panicked, and they did a run on the banks. And that didn't bother this group because they're sitting with a lot of money now from the short sell the week before, and they're sitting there with a ton of money where they can now buying stuff for a penny on the dollar. So the crash, boom, took everything down. But it created chaos in Europe. And one of the families affected, which is prominent in our Camelot history, was Jackie Kennedy's father, Blackjack Bouvier. His father and his uncle were the bankers for the Rothschilds. They were wiped out. And he started drinking and he died. He drank himself to death out of the depression of it. And her mother never forgave Joe Kennedy for that. So that irked a lot of people in Europe and the bankers over there. And then they turned around and in 1930, when the Depression was over and Roosevelt went to Joe Kennedy, he said, that was very good, kid. Now what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to rebuild the SEC with a new set of rules because they knew Europe had to reinvest back in the country to get their money back. And they did. So he rebuilt the SEC all the way up to 1935. Bang up job. Now we'd like you to do, we want to make you ambassador to England. And he goes over to England as Joe Kennedy ambassador. But he sat with some people from the Hamilton Club again and some other people, and they said, there's a few other people we want you to visit over there. We want to tie some strings together. One of the first guys he sat down with was the Shah of Iran, who was a gangster. They put a bank together. With that bank, he lent money to Hitler. The money that was lent to Hitler, Hitler came back to the same crew, add one more person, Khashoggi, and he was buying arms from him.
This is later, no?
This is in 1938, before America was in the war.
But you're talking about Adnan Khashoggi's father, that family, because he would have been a young kid.
He was a young man, but the family was in arms deals.
I see.
And they were supplying the arms to Germany. And
a lot of Wall Street bankers were involved, not just Joe Kennedy, though, in terms of Rockefeller's supplying oil.
But then the worst part was that
Dulles was involved.
The reason why Aristotle Onassis didn't like Joe Kennedy is because before America was in the war, there were convoys being blown up going down our coastline by German submarines and the information was leaking out of the New York harbors. Mm-hmm. And the ships were being blown up. Joe Kennedy was involved in the rebuilding of the ships with another Greek guy from the Netherlands and one from Greece. And so it was a full turn of events. I mean, he was supplying the ammunition,
right,
supplying the arms, the money, and then giving them the ammunition to blow up the boats, and then he turned around rebuilding the boats.
Yeah, that's the way that these war
people-
profiteers work.
Some people weren't very happy about all that jazz, and that was before America was in the war, so the fishermen, the Sicilian fishermen in New York, didn't think they were doing anything wrong because they were under thumb to Mussolini in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they got Charlie Luciano out of jail, because somebody had to stop this from happening.
Right.
And the only people that they could go to, that the government could go to, was organized crime. They went to Meyer Lansky and my father. And Meyer and my father told them, well, there's only one guy that can help you, and you got him sitting in jail.
That's Lansky. I mean, that's
Luciano.
Luciano. But your father, what was, so Albert Anastasia's role, what was his involvement with, describe, with the government at that point?
My father ran all the ports. He ran all the ports of America and the unions. And they, when this problem was going on, they said that they figured it was a way to get Charlie out of jail. So that they put the importance on Charlie. And Charlie came home, right from Dannemora, actually. He issued a thing to the head of the Sicilian fishermen that he wanted to have a conversation with him. And the guy said, Charlie Luciano. And Charlie said, really? So, and what the government never knew, or anybody knew, was that the fisherman was sitting in his house with a guy across the table from him, and they both got whacked. And the guy across the table was the #1 German spy.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually put a crimp in it right there. But they never said that. So they kept doing things all around the ports, and then my father blew up the Normandy and blamed it on the Germans. So they kept doing things that made it look like things were happening, that Charlie had to be out. If you want to stop all this stuff, you got to get Charlie Luciano out of jail. But there was the time Dewey was running around in New York and trying to get himself in line to be president, and he's the one who put Charlie away, and he said he will never walk the streets of New York. And they had him deported. As soon as he got released from Dannemora, he had him deported. And they sent him over to Rome, and then he was down in Naples, and then the United States got into the war, and the first invasion they had in Europe was in Sicily, and the government went to Charlie and they begged him for help because the Germans were so infiltrated over there that they couldn't get anybody to speak to them. They couldn't get any information as to where or how they were set up or anything. Mm-hmm. And Charlie said, why should I help you? I'm sitting over here when I want to be walking the streets of New York. And the government said, we will bring you back to America if you help us with Sicily. So Charlie went down into Sicily and he sat down for a little while with some people, and he came back with blueprints as to where the Germans hung their underwear. And the most successful, and you can look this up, the most successful invasion of the whole Second World War was Sicily. They lost hardly nobody. They walked right through Sicily. They knew exactly where they were going. They just walked right through the Germans.
Because of the information that
Charlie Luciano gave him. And then he was taken down to the islands, bringing him back into New York. As soon as Dewey heard that he was in the Bahamas and in Cuba, he had him deported again. He said he's not walking the streets of New York. So then they went back to Charlie and they asked him to help with Anzio. And he said, forget about it. And they said, no, we really need. He said, well, what are you going to do, make me the same deal?
What's Anzio?
That was the worst invasion that they had. They lost a lot of people in the invasion. And that was terrible. And Charlie said, you're not tricking me any more times. It's not, not in the game, It was a terrible thing. They lost a lot of people. And that's all because of Dewey.
Right, and that's why Dewey never became president either.
Well, it didn't come, that's another story. But when you get around to the point of what caused all this stuff, you've got to put your finger right up in New England to Joseph Kennedy.
But given all the, his nefarious background, the mafia still backed his son to become president.
They backed his son to become president because when his son went to Chicago to beg for his life again because he got into a confrontation with Frank Costello in New York, and he thought he was going to die. And they ran to Chicago again for help, and he sat down with Giancana. And this time when he sat down with Giancana was already invested with the CIA because the OSS was gone, the CIA was brand new, and the CIA could not do certain things around the world, so organized crime did wax for them in China. Giancana was in China when white men weren't allowed over there because Shanghai Shek was a gangster. And Giancana spent a lot of time over there with him. And they, you know, so he went to see Giancana and he begged for his life. And he said, I promise you both my son's ears if you help us. And Giancana said, why should I help you against my dear friends in New York? And Meyer Lansky was dead against Jack Kennedy being president. He said, we got Nixon. What do we need Kennedy for? What are you doing? And he said, well, you know, he said this, that, he had runners, women that were going back and forth to the White House with Jack Kennedy and, you know, different, Maryland and a few other people. And Sam felt he had a pretty secure deal going there. It was very beneficial to everybody. And he convinced them that this would be a better working situation. And Joe Kennedy convinced him that he had all the political power, he had their money to make his son president. And they come out to California for the nomination, and they're out here a day and a half, and he's on the phone to Sam saying, we got a problem. And Sam said, well, what are you talking about? You told me you had all this wired. You had all the electoral votes, everything in order. This was a slam dunk. Well, the state of Illinois had never been Democrat in its history. We need the state of Illinois to turn.
Because it was
Republican.
Yeah, it was Lincoln's state.
Yeah, and he said, so he made a few phone calls. Illinois turned Democrat, and 2 other states right alongside of it. And another day went by, and Joe Kennedy called him on the phone again. He said, we're still in trouble. And Sam said, you know, you told me you had all this done, blah, 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 repetitiously, blah, blah, blah. And the only state that was left that could push Kennedy across the electoral votes was West Virginia. West Virginia has a lot of electoral votes. And it was, at that time, the coal mining was big time, a lot of money there. And we had a few casinos there. And he made some phone calls, people excused some debt, and West Virginia raised their hand. And Jack Kennedy was nominated, presidency of the United States. And then when it came time to run for president, they were neck and neck, and you know, Illinois, whew, and there were dead people voting. You know, some people voted 20 times, they weren't even alive. And he got squeaked across the finish line. When they talk about what happened with Bush in Florida, that was chump change compared to what happened.
Right.
And they got him elected. And then as soon as he had him elected, the deal was that Bobby Kennedy was supposed to be, because that's the first thing Meyer said, well, what are you going to do with Bobby Kennedy? And Joe said, oh, well, we're going to send him to Ireland, make him ambassador to Ireland. And the first thing he told his son, Jack, is make your brother attorney general. And then he went to Bobby and he said, put all my good friends in jail.
Wow.
So he double-crossed Giancana and everybody else.
But the mafia didn't ultimately whack Kennedy. It wasn't just the mafia.
The mafia had nothing to do with whacking Kennedy.
Right.
So, I mean, people keep pointing fingers and saying that this guy and that guy.
I talked to Gore Vidal about it. Gore Vidal was convinced, no, the mafia did it alone.
The mafia did not do, I mean, first of all, Lee Harvey Oswald was a total patsy from day one. They chose him. His mother lived with a lieutenant from the fat man down in Carlos Marcellus. He was a lieutenant down there. She lived with him, but she was around her. She banged around with everybody. And Oswald himself, I don't know if you ever saw a television series called I Led 3 Lives. Yeah. Oswald thought he was going to be that guy. The spy. He wanted to be a spy, man, super spy. And what he did was, and all these records have disappeared from naval intelligence. There used to be a bunch of gay bars in New Orleans and in Dallas, Texas, and a few other places. And Oswald would go in, and he was mic'd, and he would talk to all the senior officers who were in these gay bars because it was a bad deal to be you know, and they blackmailed people. And he thought he was being really clever, doing all this shit, you know, and then that was giving him an inroad. And then he was introduced to a guy by the name of George de Montchild. George de Montchild came from Russia. He was a white Russian that came in with Zapruder into New York in the garment district, and they lent him $250,000, Zapruder, and they went to Dallas, Texas, and they set up the garment district down there. And George de Montchild was engaged to Jackie Kennedy's aunt. Jackie Kennedy used to call him Uncle George when she was a little kid.
Wow.
And that'll all come out one day. You understand? And when de Montchild went down to Texas, they got him close to Oswald. He taught Oswald Russian. He introduced him to a KGB's daughter. And Oswald thought he was moving to Russia to be this super spy. But Oswald couldn't keep his mouth shut. So what he didn't realize was that the KGB bugged every apartment they lived in. So he moved from this apartment to that apartment to this apartment. They finally threw him out of Russia. So now he comes back from Russia and he's a throwaway.
Right.
Everything's gone. All this Russian that he learned, all this stuff, is gone out the window. And now they're looking for a patsy for the Kennedy assassination. He was perfect. He was a throwaway. So they started to build this character up. And what people don't understand is that there was a couple of Oswalds. Mm-hmm. How does Oswald get locked up in Mexico and in New Orleans the same time and the same day?
Well, they deny one or the other.
And the FBI never said anything to the CIA, and the CIA never said, because they don't talk to each other. But the fact is, it happened. You understand? Mm-hmm. And the fact that he was such a he wasn't that great a marksman. And the guy at the shooting range was the other Oswald, who was a CIA guy. And he purposely shot at the targets to the guy next to him, and the guy said, "Hey, pal, what do you think you're doing?" "Well, I'm Lee Harvey Oswald." He's screaming out so everybody would know Lee Harvey Oswald is there on that range as a marksman.
Yeah, and that's in the film JFK. It's
and then they go and they rent a rifle. Well, you know, you ask any man worth his salt, whoever was a sniper, or whoever hunted or used a rifle at long range, you're not taking a mail order gun at bold action and firing 3 shots from a window with any accuracy. First of all, you're not doing it. It is not happening. Because if you're going to take a shot at that distance, and you have to take into the variables now. If you were telling me that they were taking the shot as the car came towards Dealey Plaza before it turned down, that was a clear shot.
Right.
You understand? They waited for it to turn down, to go down an incline, where down in Dealey Plaza, the wind dirge is amazing. None of the police could hear anything on their mics, and and you have trees, and you have signs, and you have an incline. Yeah? If I'm going to take a shot from a place, a set position with a bolt action gun, first of all, you have to let your heart arrest for 60 seconds in between shots, because your pulse is in your finger.
Right.
So you are not going to bolt action a gun.
Yeah, your first shot's going to be your best shot.
Trust me.
In that case.
You're not going to rip off 3 shots in 28 seconds. It's never going to happen.
But your friend Johnny Roselli told you some other things that happened that day that were not part of the commission report.
Roselli was in the cauldron down in the street, which is now cemented over. In fact, they did a documentary, I think, last year about this cauldron. There's a cauldron that I could walk down from the river. And that cauldron was cemented over, I think 4 or 5 months right after the Kennedy assassination. They closed it off. The first shot came from a rifle there, and it hit Kennedy in the throat. And when you see him grab his throat and fall forward, then he got shot in the back, in his lower back, that no one ever talked about. But before he fell forward, Connolly got shot, and he spun on top of his wife's lap. Jack fell on top of him. Yeah? And the third shot came from Greer, the driver. And what he did was he slowed, all these shots are coming off here, And instead of the guy speeding up to get out of Dealey Plaza, he slowed down. And then he veered to the left and cut off the motorcycle guy. And if you look at the Zapruder film, you'll see all the Secret Service guys peel away from Kennedy's car before the shooting started.
Mm-hmm.
There was nobody standing alongside that car. No one wanted to be in the way of what was going to happen. You understand? And the third shot came from the drive. When he slowed the car down, all he did was go like that because Kennedy was right there in front of him, and you see him fly back and the back of his head comes out.
The kill shot. But did you know going into Dallas the day before that there was going to be an assassination, or you just knew there was an event?
There was something happening.
Something was in the air.
There was something happening. And what people really don't understand, I never found out till afterwards, that the man who orchestrated this whole thing, and he did it for the trilateral families, was Carlos Sanchez, the Jackal. And that was the first thing he ever did in America. And he was the most prolific assassin in all the world. This guy, they could never catch him. And when you sit down and look at all the people that were at Dealey Plaza that day, there were several hobos that come out of the train stop. Woody Harrelson's father was one of them, who was a hitman for New Orleans. Okay? And he was with a bunch of other guys. There were 32 possible people at Dealey Plaza that they could have pulled trigger. They had the windows of the Byrd building, which Byrd was financed by H.L. Hunt, who was at Murchison's the night before as well. Right? And you have the President of the United States in an open car below a building where the windows on the fourth floor or third floor are wide open, people walking around, moving boxes. Never happened. Never happened in the world's age. It just never happens. And then people walking out of the train thing, going up over this bridge, that car is going to go under? Please. And not one Secret Service guy on the bridge? And then you got a guy called Zapruder, who never had a camera in his hand before in his life and suffered from vertigo, and he had to stand up high, so they were holding him by the legs. And all these gunshots going off around him, 13 shots were fired that day, and he never took his finger off the camera.
Yeah, that makes no
sense. For
sense.
the 28 seconds.
Never reacts to anything. It's just very calm.
And the film was already sold to Life magazine for $150,000.
It's a public sacrifice.
So all the componentries that were there, nobody ever talks about. How did Jack Ruby get into a closed-off police station garage with a weapon? How come the captain of the police that was standing beside Oswald stepped aside when he saw Ruby coming?
Presumably because of his mafia ties.
Because the guy who was a captain of the police force of Dallas had a relative who was a high-ranking Navy official, I think he was. And Joe Kennedy told his son, this guy did something, and they threw him out of the service. And that anger made this guy play the game in Dallas. And they never took a note when they questioned Lee Harvey Oswald. There was not one note, not one tape, nothing.
But you said that Carlos the Jackal works for the trilateral families. Now, what are we talking about? Who are the trilateral families you're referring to here?
That's
because ultimately you're saying these are the real people behind it.
You're talking about the Illuminati. If you think they're not real, you're a fool.
I'm not saying that.
You know, I mean, anybody who looked, I mean, there was a time, at the time of the Kennedy assassination and 10 years before, if you ever mentioned the word Illuminati in America, people were looking over their shoulders. It was a scary thing to talk about. And the trilateral family was a scary thing to talk about.
And these are the ones based in Geneva?
That's where they house themselves, in Geneva. But you're talking about the Rothschilds, you're talking about the Samuel family, the Montefiore's, you're talking about the banking families of the world.
Right.
People who put the banking system together. And this guy did nothing but stab needles in their eyes. One man.
Joe Kennedy.
Yeah. One guy. So why wouldn't they be a little bit angry?
But was there something that John had done that particularly to upset them.
John Kennedy?
Yeah.
John Kennedy was one of the nicest guys in the world and a great politician.
No, but I'm saying in terms of his policies, in terms of, let's say, the fact he wasn't going to escalate the Vietnam War or the attack on the Federal Reserve System.
There were several things that were done, but his father had a tremendous control over him. Whispered in his ear quite a bit, the same as he whispered in Bobby's ear.
But he had a stroke. No, was it 62?
That was bogus.
It was what, to get him out of the spotlight?
I just think that there was a reason for him to stay indoors. I think he was in fear of his life for a period of time, and that's my own personal opinion. But some other people have spoken the same words. People talked to him during this period he was supposed to have a stroke, and he was very lucid, and he's still bringing broads into his house. His wife was still screaming at him. I mean, nobody looks at the truth. They look at what they want to believe and what the media feeds them. No one really wants to know what really happened because it scares them to think that something like that could happen. I mean, this is the greatest country in the world. And we really, today, need to take our country back. I'm so proud of being an American, but I don't like what I see happening. And this was one of the things that started the escalation of downfalls.
That's when I say now the deep state is thoroughly ensconced in our government. And as I said, in American war machine, there's a mindset in Washington, and the president doesn't choose the mindset chooses the president.
What really is behind is that those who control the information about the alien presence on Earth, want to keep it to themselves. There's been hundreds of trillions of dollars have been spent on doing the research and on dealing with this subject since 1947.